The second of 4 videos that will teach you how to diagram an argument. In this video, you will learn how to pull out of a passage of text the statements that actually play a role in the argument, or the elements of the argument. In any passage you read, you have to ask yourself, how much of this passage is actually part of the argument? We know that an argument is made up of premises and a conclusion. And we have, in the previous video, made a distinction between informational text, which may tell you some facts, but not draw any conclusion, and an argument, which does draw a conclusion. The issue is that we will sometimes have a passage that is mixed. There is an argument, but here and there in the midst of it, there's a little bit of informational text, maybe a transitional statement, maybe a definition or an example or a parenthetical remark. So we need to go through the passage and pull out the statements that actually play a role in the argument. In the previous video, we looked at these 2 passages from the book Blue versus Black by John Burris. We decided that the passage on the left is merely informational, that the passage on the right, however, is an argument. So let's look more closely at that argument to see what the elements of it are. In this argument, we asked ourselves our most important question. What is this author trying to get me to do or believe? And we concluded that Mr. Burris wants us to make sure that police officers are trained very carefully in how to use a carotid restraint. We then asked ourselves, what reasons does Mr. Burris give us for accepting his conclusion? And we were able to determine that there were 2. First, that the carotid restraint is an extremely precise maneuver, and secondly, that if it's misused, you can kill someone. But notice that although that seemed perfectly sensible when we did it, if we look at the passage, there's an entire phrase we've left out. It is set off by dashes, and I wonder why they must when pepper spray and stun guns are available. The fact that Mr. Burris set it off with those dashes lets us know this is a parenthetical remark, so we were right to leave it out. In this passage, there is just this one little remark that is not an element of the argument. We might also find in any given argument unstated or assumed premises. Sometimes there's just background information that the author thinks you already know, or the author doesn't want to bore you by stepping through an argument too slowly. For that reason, there may be some parts of the argument that just aren't on the page. The author knows you will bring those mentally to the passage and hasn't written them down. When you go to make your list of statements, however, you need to add those in. As in the passage from Mr. Burris, there may also be some things in the argument that you need to remove from your statement list. So sometimes there's fewer elements in the argument than what you see on the page. The key is always just use common sense and ask yourself, what is this author trying to get me to do or believe, and what reasons are given to convince me to do so? Trying to determine what the author's reasons or conclusions are in an argument, we can look for indicator words. In any time an author writes, he or she will try to give you some sense of the structure of the text by giving road signs like transitional sentences to show how one paragraph links to another. In an argument, the way an author might do this is using specific indicator words to let you know that the phrase that follows is either a premise or a conclusion. So when you're beginning to diagram an argument, it's useful to go through and find these indicator words and circle them. This is a list of premise indicators. It's not exhaustive. There are many others, but these are some of the most common ones. As we begin to work with arguments in this video and the ones that follow, you'll want to have this list handy so that you can circle these words when you see them. So why don't you pause the video right now, take whatever notes you want to take from this slide, and then hit play when you're ready to continue. This is a list of conclusion indicators. Some of them are fairly obvious, like we may conclude, but some of them are kind of old-fashioned, like hence or thus. As I said about the premise indicators, you may need this list as we go forward and do the exercises in the various videos. So pause the video, take your notes, and hit play when you're ready to continue. All right, now we need to put it all together. Here is a passage that is an argument from philosopher Don Marquis. In this passage, he's going to argue that what makes a murder wrong is that the victim has lost his or her future. Just as an aside, it's interesting to note that Marquis could have argued that what's wrong about murder is that the loved ones of the victim are sad because they've lost their friend or their spouse or their child. Or he could have argued that murder violates the dignity of human life. But instead, he's taking this kind of creative approach and arguing that what's wrong when somebody is killed is that that person has lost his or her future. We're going to take this passage and work through it using all of the skills that we've just talked about. First, I'm going to ask myself, what is Marquis trying to get me to do or believe? And he wants me to believe that what makes killing wrong is the loss of the victim's future. He follows that with this phrase, my conclusion, I'm just going to call that his conclusion, is directly supported by two considerations. I love it when authors use a number like that. I can even stop reading at this point and skim the rest of the passage looking for some indicator word to show me what these two considerations are. And here they are. First and second. I now know that the two phrases that follow those indicator words will be the two major premises used to support the conclusion. But as I read the passage, and I hope you are reading the passage as we go along, I notice that there's another indicator word, because. This tells me that there's going to be a little sub-argument here. This premise is going to support that first premise, which then supports the conclusion. So let's take this argument and generate our list of statements that all serve as elements of the argument. Just move it on. Here's our argument. Premise indicator circled. Let's make our list. The first statement that's very important is the conclusion. What makes killing wrong is the loss of the victim's future. Next, I have my first main premise, that this theory that the loss of one's future is the reason for killing, the reason that killing is wrong, is what makes sense of our moral intuition that killing is one of the worst crimes. Next, I'm told that killing deprives the victim of more than perhaps any other crime. And remember, because I have that premise indicator, I know that this statement, number 3, is a premise being used to prove statement number 2. In the second place, I am told that people who are dying, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here, that people who know they are dying think that the loss of their future is what makes that death so horrible. Now you'll notice I've added one assumed premise. If you look at statement number 3, killing deprives the victim of more than other crimes, I felt that didn't really stand on its own without the assumption that the loss of one's future is worse than, say, the loss of property through theft or my health through a physical attack. So I added that assumed premise. Notice also that I put a letter on that one. If it's in the text, if it's a stated premise or conclusion, I number that statement. Statements that I have to add in because they're assumed or unstated, I use letters for. On your own. On this slide, we have a passage from the website procon.org arguing that capital punishment should be made illegal. Go through the passage, circle any premise indicators or conclusion indicators you find, and begin to generate a list of statements. I do have one little note there at the bottom just to make sure that we are comprehending this text. In the history of philosophy, there have been two major arguments given for using capital punishment, and those arguments are that capital punishment deters other murders and that capital punishment is a just retribution for murder. Because those are the two reasons used for capital punishment, this author, who is arguing against it, must respond to both of those arguments, and does so in this passage. The note is only there so that you will understand the meaning of these two terms, deterrence and retribution, since the author kind of assumes you're familiar with the overall issue of capital punishment. Okay, I'm going to set you loose. You go circle your indicator words and create your list. Pause the video until you're done, and when you're ready, I'll show you what I came up with. First, circling indicator words. There aren't a lot of them in this passage. I only have two, for this simple reason and because. But I love this one for this simple reason, because it's a two-way indicator. It tells me that what is about to come is a reason and therefore a premise. But it also tells me that the phrase right before it, the sentence that says execution should be banned by act of Congress, is the conclusion. That's the conclusion that is supported by the reason that follows. So I really like that one. Here's our passage with our indicator words circled. And we already know that the conclusion of the overall argument is that first statement: executions should be banned by Congress. Following that is my major premise: the death penalty doesn't serve the cause of justice. What comes next is a rhetorical question. How likely is it, we're asked, that a killer will be more deterred by the risk of the death penalty than by having to spend the rest of his life in prison? This claim fails the test of common sense, we're told. But notice that there's no real statement here. It's a question, not a statement. So I have to figure out how my author assumes I will answer that question. And that is an assumed premise. And there it is. My author is hoping that I will say, no, killers will not be deterred by the death penalty more than they would by life in prison. So I've made this an unstated or assumed premise, and I've used the letter A rather than a number to indicate that it's unstated rather than stated. The next phrase tells me that criminologists and police chiefs say that the death penalty doesn't influence murderers, and so I've made that a premise. Now you may have turned this into two separate premises. One saying that criminologists say the death penalty doesn't deter, and the other one saying police chiefs say that the death penalty doesn't deter. That's just a matter of your choice. But there is a good reason for separating it in that way. As we continue through this video series, you'll learn how to determine if an argument is cogent. And one of the elements of a cogent argument is that the premises are true. What if we find out that criminologists say that the death penalty doesn't deter, but that police chiefs think it does? Is this statement true or false? By separating it into two, I can say, well, this one's true and that one's false. So sometimes it's important to separate these. For now, I'm going to leave it together. But the point is, sometimes your list of statements will differ from someone else's. And sometimes it's just a matter of how you saw it versus how someone else saw it, and that's okay. The key to this is to make sure you don't oversimplify the argument and take an argument like this one and have just two statements. That would mean you've really missed a lot. Or that you just proliferate statements left and right and end up with 20. Then you've probably gone for overkill. As long as you and someone else can have a conversation about why you made the choices you did and why they made the choices they did, and it makes sense to both of you, you're probably on the right track. Okay. The next premise is indicated by the indicator word because, and it is this: the death penalty is applied haphazardly. We then have this sentence: it's true that the purpose of punishment is not only deterrence, but also retribution. This is merely a transition sentence. It tells the reader, look, I've talked about deterrence and now I'm going to turn my attention to retribution. But it doesn't make a claim of any kind. It's not a statement that functions in the argument. There is, however, an assumption that I'm going to be able to show you that the death penalty is not an appropriate retribution for murder. That makes sense since we know this person is arguing against the death penalty. I've added that assumed premise, again using a letter, this time B, rather than a number since it's not actually stated. The next sentence tells us that killing killers would be just like raping rapists or stealing from thieves. And there seems to be another assumption, which you might add yourself as letter C, that that's ridiculous. We wouldn't rape a rapist, so why would we kill a killer? Seems to be the point with number 5. And last, we're told that retribution should be restrained to be just. So here we have a nice little list of all of the statements that are elements of the argument. We've left some out because they don't play a role, and we've added some others because they do. We're ready to roll. In the next video, we'll take that list of statements you've created and turn it into a diagram. So make sure that you've got them written down and you're ready to bring that list of all the statements in the argument from Don Marquis about killing taking a person's future and the argument from Procon about capital punishment. Have those lists in front of you and we'll move on to the next video.